I wore my best sweater to a party I wasn't invited to. The porch light glowed like a watchful eye above the door, and I held a cracked blue teacup inside my coat pocket, the way some women hold a Bible. Inside, music swelled and somebody laughed in the note that used to be my name. My father's watch clicked steady as a metronome. My mother smoothed her hair. "You don't belong here," they said. Maybe I didn't, but I had come to return something they forgot I owned. The salt crunched under my shoes as I stepped onto the mat, the sound too loud in my own ears. The invitation creased, stained with diner coffee, rested in my purse like a dare. I touched its edge with gloved fingers, proof that I wasn't lost. Through the doorway, the room shone with chandeliers and crystal glasses, women in sequined sleeves brushing against men in pressed suits. Waiters carried trays of champagne light flashing across the rims. I tugged my cardigan closer. It was plain wool, a thrift store find I wore to church potlucks and grocery runs. They belonged to polished surfaces and curated laughter. I came from modest kitchens and late shifts from places where coffee cups chipped and stayed chipped. The contrast wasn't just visible, it hummed in the air between us like a second song. I stood just inside the doorway, the wool of my cardigan prickling at my neck, and thought about how many times in my life I had already practiced disappearing. It didn't begin tonight. It began in kitchens where the only sound was my father's watch against the table and my mother whispering, "Keep the peace," as if peace was something you could iron into a shirt. I was a girl who learned that silence was safer than questions. When my father set down his fork too hard, I knew how to clear dishes without letting porcelain touch. When he closed his office door, I knew how to tiptoe across the hallway without floorboards groaning. Quiet was the skill I mastered long before music or math. By high school, I could walk out of a gymnasium full of students, and no one would notice I was gone. I remember my senior band concert, the one time I hit the high note without wobble. The audience clapped politely, but my father had already stepped outside to take a business call. My mother kept her eyes on the program in her lap, smiling faintly, though not at me. I folded my own program into a tiny fan, the paper creasing into ridges like ribs. That was the first time I realized I could make myself smaller and nobody would protest. Later on my wedding morning, the boutonniere pin slipped while I tried to fix it to my groom's jacket. The metal pricked my finger, a single dot of red staining the ivory silk. Nobody noticed. I pinned it back quickly, and when my maid of honor asked what happened, I laughed and said nothing. The safety pin I found on the floor held the fabric together, but I felt the sting all day under the lace. That was how I lived, covering small wounds with jokes, keeping the seams from showing. After the divorce, when the apartment echoed with no voices but mine, I turned on the porch light each evening before I left for night shifts. The glow wasn't for anyone else. It was for me, a reminder that I still had a door worth returning to. The chipped blue teacup came with me in the cardboard box of kitchen things, cracked on the rim but still able to hold heat. I kept it, though I threw out better cups, because it stayed true in its brokenness. At the shelter where I first volunteered, one woman asked for soap that smelled like apples. Her lip was split and her hand trembled when she signed the form. I wrote her request on a small card and taped it above the supply closet door. Nobody else cared about the scent, but I did. Keeping that promise mattered more than any applause I'd never gotten. It reminded me that listening could be an action. In rooms where I was never seen, I could at least learn to see others. And yet, here I was tonight, standing in a hall with chandeliers and champagne, dressed in thrift store wool, holding my cracked teacup against my ribs as though it were armor. I didn't come to drink their wine or to bask in chandeliers. I came because I owed something to the girl who once folded programs into fans, and to the woman who once asked for apple soap. My belonging might not be announced from a podium, but I was ready to carve it into the air by simply staying. I hung my coat in the closet, feeling the teacup tap against me with each movement like a heartbeat insisting on being heard. Aunt Jo caught my eye from across the room. She gave me the smallest nod, not dramatic, just enough to remind me that somebody remembered who I was before I learned to vanish. That tiny gesture felt louder than the music. For the first time that evening, I believed I might not have to disappear at all. The sign-in table stood like a border between worlds. On one side, women in sequined sleeves leaned close to scrawl their names with flourishes, leaving trails of perfume and laughter. On the other side stood me, clutching the folded invitation from my purse, my gloves still faintly salted from the walk-in. My sister Lindsay planted herself in front of the ledger, as if she had been waiting for this moment all evening. "It's a closed list," she said, her voice sweet enough to drip, but sharp enough to cut. She tilted her head in a practiced gesture of hostess grace, the kind she perfected in college sorority halls, but her eyes dared me to push back. I slid the invitation across the table. The crease ran through the middle like a scar, the grease stain dark at the corner. She didn't even glance at it. Her fingers rested lightly on the gold-tipped pen as if she were a guard of state secrets. I might have walked away. I had walked away so many times before. But then Mr. Klein, the venue manager, stepped from behind a curtain with the neutral stride of someone used to conflict over seating charts. He flipped the heavy ledger to a page near the back. The bold print read, "Maple Foundation Reception." He tapped the letters once with his pen. "Confirmed under this name." Lindsay's smile faltered, lips parting, teeth catching the light. She tried to laugh, but it stuck in her throat. She looked over her shoulder as though someone might come rescue her from paperwork that didn't lie. My father was already striding forward, his polished shoes striking the floor in metronome rhythm, the click of his watch audible even under the hum of voices. He didn't greet me. He addressed Mr. Klein with the crispness of a man used to being obeyed. "We'll handle it," he said. Then to me, in a voice pitched low, meant to travel no farther than my ears, "Don't make a scene." That old instruction landed like a hand on my shoulder, invisible but heavy. How many times had I heard those exact words in kitchens, in church pews, in living rooms, where silence was survival. I tasted iron in my mouth, though there was no blood. My mother appeared then, carrying a silver tray of lemon bars dusted with sugar. She set them on the edge of the table but turned the plate slightly away from me, the angle subtle but intentional. "You know how these things are," she murmured, not to me, not even to the air exactly, but to the invisible company of appearances she served so faithfully. She smoothed her blouse with her free hand, the fabric smelling faintly of the apple soap she had favored since I was a girl. I looked down at the card marked "Overflow" placed neatly beside the ledger. It was meant for me, a silent designation that I could stay but only at the margins. I picked it up. My fingers pressed against the heavy stock, and for a moment I imagined folding it into a fan as I had done with concert programs years ago. Instead, I set it back down square in the center of the table, not hidden at the side, my first tiny act of reclamation. Pastor Hale approached, then his hair grayer, his voice still smooth as oil. He shook my hand as if I were a stranger visiting his parish. "Nice of you to stop by," he said, his eyes sliding past me toward the main hall. He didn't remember the afternoons he had sat in our living room when I was 14, telling me to forgive quickly so the family could move forward. He remembered only his own words, not the girl who had swallowed them. Around me, the chatter swelled, then dipped as people noticed the tableau. Lindsay's frozen smile, my father's clipped jaw, my mother's lemon bars turned away. Pastor Hale's perfunctory greeting. I hummed the melody Aunt Jo once taught me just under my breath, Moon River barely audible. It steadied me the way counting light bulbs had steadied Maya in the clinic waiting room. I stepped aside, not because I was yielding, but because I was choosing my place. From that angle, I could see the shimmer of chandeliers reflecting off champagne glasses, the swirl of silk dresses, the posture of people who had never wondered whether they belonged in a room. I stood in my cardigan, plain wool, a thrift store find, the cracked teacup heavy in my coat pocket, tapping my ribs like a knock that wouldn't quit. Then the doors opened again, and in swept Maya. Her winter coat was too large, borrowed from the hospital's lost and found, but her smile was so wide it startled the light in the room itself. She scanned the crowd, uncertain, until her eyes landed on me. Relief broke across her face like sunrise through cloud. She lifted her hand in a wave meant only for me, not for the glittering crowd, not for the chandeliers or champagne. That single gesture cut through the silence sharper than my father's watch or my sister's polished grin. In that moment, I remembered exactly why I had come. Not to beg for a place at their table. Not to take sugar-dusted lemon bars turned away from me. I had come to keep a promise to myself, to Maya, to every version of me who had been told not to make a scene. And if my presence alone was a scene, then let it be the quiet kind that leaves a mark no one can sweep aside. The chandeliers above the hall glowed like frozen suns, their light catching on every sequin and polished shoe. But for me, the air felt heavy, as if I were still carrying the cracked teacup pressed against my ribs. My sister glided past me toward the buffet table, her cardigan glittering like tinsel, already whispering to someone about how family pulls together, while her eyes flicked over me as though I were a misplaced chair. My father stationed himself near the podium, adjusting his tie, clicking his watch in rhythm to the clink of glasses. My mother busied herself by straightening platters, touching the silver ladle handles so they lined in exact rows, her silence more punishing than words. But the truth was that I hadn't come here to fight them in their own language of appearances. I had come because of a promise, one I made in a place far from chandeliers and champagne, a promise I refused to break. I thought back to 2 years earlier, to the stale hallway of a clinic where the fluorescent lights hummed louder than voices. I had been volunteering there on a Tuesday night, helping organize donated coats, when I noticed a girl hunched near the vending machine. She was 19, her shoulders pulled tight as if she wanted to fold herself inside the sweatshirt she wore. Her name was Maya, though she whispered it so quietly I had to ask twice. Her hands trembled, her lip still swollen from whatever she had left behind. She told me she couldn't breathe right in crowds, that the panic came like a storm without warning. I remembered Aunt Jo's old trick, the way she taught me to ground myself in moments when silence felt like suffocation. Count the lights one by one, and let the numbers make a path out of the fear. I taught it to Maya that night, pointing up at the bulbs flickering overhead, and I watched her shoulders loosen just slightly as she whispered the numbers with me. That was the first time I realized that the smallest acts, counting bulbs, noticing soap scents, carrying a chipped cup, could become lifelines when the world had forgotten your name. After that evening, I promised her something: that one day there would be a space where she and women like her would walk in and find their needs already waiting, not as charity but as acknowledgement. I didn't know how to build that space, but I carried the promise like a stone in my pocket. The following year, I worked extra shifts at the library, sold my grandmother's quilt, though it tore at me, said no to replacing my worn shoes. At night, when the walls of my apartment felt too thin and the porch light flickered in the wind, I sat at the kitchen table and learned the language of grants from photocopied handouts. I scribbled drafts on the backs of grocery receipts, crossing out words until my pen tore the paper. The blue teacup sat on the table beside me, always filled, always chipped, always reminding me that imperfect things still held. One afternoon in the bank office, the loan officer mispronounced my name, mixing it with my ex-husband's. I corrected him once softly, and when he tried again and still failed, I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I wrote it clearly on the form, underlining it twice, a reminder that I was not someone else's leftover. Small perhaps, but it was a claim. Months later, after rejections and long waits, I walked into Mr. Klein's office at the community center. He had a ledger spread across his desk, the ink smudged from other families' anniversaries, graduations, and galas. I asked about off-season rates. He looked at me skeptically at first, perhaps because of my plain clothes, perhaps because I carried a canvas bag instead of a briefcase. But when I placed the deposit on the counter, counted down to the last dollar, his eyebrows lifted. "Under what name should I list it?" he asked. I hesitated, then said my mother's maiden name, Clara May Ellis. It was a name she had not used since she was 20, a name she rarely even whispered. It was the name of the girl in the photograph at the county fair, laughing with her head thrown back before she learned to press her lips into careful smiles. I wanted the fund to honor that version of her, the one unclaimed by silence. I signed the contract with a steady hand. Tonight in this hall, the result of that work lay in my purse, a thick envelope holding the certificate of donation, embossed and sealed, bearing my mother's forgotten name. Aunt Jo had proofread it for me, making sure not a letter was wrong. The idea that my family might discover it and try to take credit had crossed my mind, but I underestimated the speed. As I slipped the envelope back into my bag, I saw Lindsay at a side table leafing through a stack of programs. Her eyes widened when she found the insert about the fund. Her lips parted in surprise, then quickly shaped into a hostess's grin as she turned to whisper with 2 other guests. I caught fragments, our family's surprise gift. Yes, such generosity runs deep. She was already weaving herself into the story, laying claim to the work that had cost me years of nights, shoes, quilts, and quiet battles with mispronounced names. I inhaled, felt my chest tighten, and did what I had taught Maya to do. I counted the sconces on the wall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each glow steadied me. My fingers brushed the cracked rim of the teacup inside my coat as if reminding me that holding steady was not weakness. I decided in that moment that I wouldn't argue for credit. I wouldn't let them bait me into shouting into confirming the caricature of being difficult. I wouldn't fight for attention. I would fight for clarity. The lights dimmed, then signaling the start of speeches. Guests took their seats, the clink of glassware subsiding into polite hush. My father climbed the podium, first notes in his hand. The watch clicked against the microphone as he adjusted it. My name was nowhere in his pages. I could see the lines already praise for unity, for family, for traditions carried forward by those who stood behind him on stage. My mother waited with her lemon bars, rehearsing the smile she had perfected decades ago. Lindsay stood near the front, already basking in applause she hadn't yet received. The weight of exclusion pressed hard, but beneath it pulsed something steadier, something forged in late nights and apple-scented promises. I sat in the second row, close enough to hear the watch, close enough to see the light tremble on my mother's ring. I kept one hand on the envelope, one on the teacup, and thought of Maya waiting for her name to be said properly. I thought of the girl at the county fair in 1984, laughing with abandon. I thought of myself standing in thrift store wool, choosing not to vanish this time. The speeches began, but the real words I carried had yet to be spoken, and when the moment came, I knew I would rise. My father's voice rolled smooth across the microphone, the same tone he used at Rotary dinners and church auctions, every word polished until no edges showed. He thanked the community, praised my sister's organization, spoke of unity, tradition, legacy. My name never crossed his lips. Applause scattered like coins on pavement, and when my mother took the podium, she listed vendors, church ladies, neighbors, her eyes sliding over me like I was glass. Then Lindsay stepped forward, smile wide, announcing, "Tonight we also celebrate a gift to women in need from our family." She let the words drip with ownership, as if sacrifice and midnight shifts had been shared across the table instead of borne alone at my kitchen counter. I rose slowly, every eye turning, not because I was named, but because silence shifted. Mr. Klein stepped forward, handing me the program binder he had kept safe under contract. My father intercepted me at the podium stairs, his jaw-tight watch ticking loud. "You don't belong here." He said it low, meant only for me. I slid the cracked blue teacup from my pocket and set it on the podium edge. The room stilled. I lifted the certificate. I booked this room. I made this promise. I belong. The silence after my words felt heavier than any music that had filled the hall. The chandeliers hummed with electricity forks, stilled against plate sequins froze in the light. I did not fill the pause with explanation. I let it breathe because sometimes silence says more than speech ever could. Then I gestured gently toward the back, and Maya, still wrapped in her oversized coat, stepped forward. For a second, she looked as if she might turn back, but when her eyes found mine, she straightened. She unbuttoned her coat with careful hands, revealing the simple nurse's uniform beneath. A hush fell, deeper curiosity, sharpening into something closer to awe. She walked to the microphone, her shoes soft against the polished floor, and when she spoke, her voice was small but clear. She told them she was 19 when she walked into a clinic, afraid to even say her own name. How she met a volunteer who handed her apple-scented soap and taught her to breathe by counting the bulbs overhead. She said that night changed her, not because the world suddenly grew kinder, but because one person reminded her that she was not invisible. Her words weren't dramatic. They were plain, almost clinical in their precision, but that very simplicity gave them weight. A man coughed at the back. Someone shifted a chair. I saw my mother's face, the practiced smile, slipping her hand, hovering over her plate as if she had forgotten what to do with it. Lindsay tried to interject, stepping half toward the stage, but Mr. Klein moved discreetly into her line of sight, a reminder of contracts signed and names written in ink that couldn't be smudged away by a smile. Then, almost as if on cue, a projector, lit the back wall. The first slide appeared a faded photo strip from the County Fair 1984. My mother, Clara May Ellis, then her hair, wind-blown head thrown back in laughter, clutching a cheap paper prize as though it were gold. The room murmured. That image was unfamiliar to most, even to me, until Aunt Jo dug it out of an old drawer. It was my proof that another version of my mother had once lived unpracticed, uncontained. I stepped to the microphone once more and said, "The fund is not in my name, it is in hers. For the girl who laughed like that before she learned to press her lips closed. For every woman who forgot she deserved to be heard." My voice shook, not from fear, but from release. Pastor Hale surprised me then. He walked forward, his hand resting briefly on the podium. "Our church pantry will partner with this fund," he said, his tone more solemn than his usual rehearsed platitudes. His eyes found mine, and for the first time since I was a girl, I felt seen by him, not as an accessory to family, but as a whole person. The audience shifted. Some began clapping hesitantly, then more joined, until the sound became a pulse that filled the hall. It was not a standing ovation, not thunderous, but steady, human like rain tapping a roof. The applause belonged to no one family. It belonged to the truth that had been placed on the table like the cracked teacup itself. My father did not clap. His watch ticked on his wrist louder in my ears than the applause, but I noticed something. He did not move forward to silence me again. My mother's eyes glistened, a tear tracing down before she brushed it quickly, but the mark remained a shine out of place among lemon sugar. Lindsay folded her program into a crease so hard the paper threatened to tear, her smile still on her face but brittle as glass. And me, I stood there with no need to defend further. I had already said exactly why I came, and Maya had embodied it better than I ever could. When the applause ebbed, I stepped away from the microphone. My heart beat steady, not racing, as though every long night of work had prepared my lungs for this quiet endurance. The porch light outside glowed faintly through the frosted glass panels, reminding me that belonging was not about who held the microphone, but about who chose to stand and stay. I looked once more at the photo glowing behind me. My mother, before silence, before lemon soap smiles, before my father's watch, dictated the beat of every dinner. That was the woman I wanted the fund to remember. That was the reason I used her maiden name, not to shame her, but to restore her, at least in public record, to herself. Guests leaned toward each other, whispers carrying not derision but questions. Who had done this? How had it been hidden? Why had they never known? For the first time, curiosity turned toward me, not as scandal, but as witness. I gathered the certificate back into its envelope, slid it inside my coat, and left the teacup on the podium, the crack visible under the chandelier light. It looked fragile there, but also unmovable, like a relic no one could dismiss. I stepped down into the crowd, each step slow, measured, not furtive like the girl I had been. Hands brushed my sleeve as I passed, not all of them, but enough. A neighbor nodded, eyes soft. An old teacher whispered, "Proud of you." The applause had faded, but something steadier remained: acknowledgement. I had not come for their approval. I had come to return my silence and leave clarity in its place, and now the clarity hung in the air, undeniable. I passed by Lindsay, who kept her smile rigid, the program still clenched in her hand. She hissed softly, "You made a scene." I paused, met her eyes, and answered evenly, "No, I told the truth." Then I walked on, not waiting for her response. At the edge of the hall, Aunt Jo caught my hand. She pressed a small tuning fork into my palm, her fingers squeezing gently. "In case the room goes sharp," she whispered. I smiled for the first time that evening, a smile unpracticed, small, but entirely mine. The chandeliers glowed overhead, but I no longer felt their weight. I carried the fun, the cracked teacups echo Maya's steady voice, and the memory of a mother who once laughed without fear. Exactly why I came, and exactly why I would not leave unseen. When the lights brightened again and the music returned, I felt the room tilt, not against me this time, but around me, as if people were adjusting to a new center of gravity. My father approached first, his face composed but rigid, the watch still ticking at his wrist. "You embarrassed us," he murmured low enough for only me to hear. I looked at him steadily and answered with one word: "No." I didn't explain, didn't soften, just let the refusal stand like a wall he could not move. My mother lingered near the scent of her apple soap drifting close. For the first time, she whispered her own name, Clara May, as though testing how it tasted after decades of silence. Her eyes brimmed with tears she couldn't disguise. Lindsay tried to spin control back her way, hissing, "We'll post the fund from the family page." I met her gaze and said simply, "Post it from the fund page." She blinked, not used to resistance without anger, and had no answer. Evan slipped me his card out of habit, but I crossed a line through his old number and handed it back. "Call me directly," I said, giving him a brother he might still have. Aunt Jo pressed a tiny tuning fork into my hand. "In case the room goes sharp," she whispered, and her kindness steadied me more than applause. I left the cracked teacup on a side table near the exit, not abandoned but installed a quiet plaque to endurance. Later, driving home under the clear winter sky, the porch light I had left on greeted me like a companion, not a test. I brewed tea in a plain mug, no longer needing the chipped one to remind me of survival. Belonging was not their gift to grant. It was something I carried, something I kept. Tonight the house was quiet, and I was not.